Our guest speaker today is Jacklyn Morrison. Jacklyn moved to Idaho in 2018 after retiring from UC Davis Medical Center in California, where she was a certified clinical research professional working directly with physicians in clinical trials with pharmaceutical companies. Her talk today is about her efforts to get a memorial installed in a national park to commemorate a plane crash that occurred over 70 years ago, in which 8 men perished. So will you please welcome Jacklyn. Will you drop the lights back there, please?
Good morning. Sue and I have worked on this presentation for about a year. And so I'm going to be telling you a little story about an aviation accident that happened on December 26, 1951. And this was something that was near and dear to my heart because I know that it affected multiple families, including my own. And I have been in and out of around Mount Lassen. I have hiked to the crash site, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of history about that, and also how long it took me and 1,000 other people to put together some type of commemorative information. And when I started looking in 2000, it was in the mid-90s. My cousin and I were interested in this, and he got a lot of records from the government about the plane crash. And then I started looking on Ancestry for other surviving children. And that's how I kind of got started down the road in 2012. I got real serious about this project in probably 2016, 2017, and there were a lot of people involved. Again, this crash happened in Mount Lassen National Park. For years, for decades as a child, I thought the plane crashed directly into Mount Lassen. But it didn't. It was about 1.5 miles short on Crescent Crater Ridge, on a ridge. And I do have a few pictures and things. Naturally, my notes are not in order. On Christmas Day, 1951, this DC-47A transport plane left Travis Air Force Base in Northern California. It went on a 3-day administrative assignment, and there were 3 members of the flight crew: Major John Odell, Odell's close friend and co-captain Vernon E. Moe, the aircraft flight engineer Corporal Jesse Keller. According to the flight order, they were to fly to Great Falls, Montana, with 2 additional passengers and deliver these men who were supposed to do, according to the flight order, some type of aviation mechanical work. For an unknown reason, the plane ended up at Fairchild in Spokane. So I've never been able to confirm that it ever actually made it to its destination in Great Falls. They stayed overnight, and the following morning, on December 26th, even though the weather was bad and a lot of airports were shutting down, Fairchild did allow this plane to take off, destined back home to Travis Air Force Base. And the 3 crew members picked up 5 hitchhikers. They started their flight. It was supposed to be approximately, they had enough fuel for an 8-hour flying time, even though they expected the flight to be under 5 hours. The entire West Coast had the significant winter storms, and they did file their flight plan and they did depart about noon. The last radio contact was made over Klamath Falls, Oregon at 16:17 in the afternoon. The flight subsequently encountered severe deteriorating weather and forecast crosswinds, and apparently it is deemed that they were blown off course to the east of the designated route and could not get reliable radio signals just short of Lassen's Peak or Lassen's devastated area. If any of you have been to Lassen, you know that there's a large side of Lassen that's called devastated area. The Air Force conducted an extensive air and ground search along the planned route until mid-January, but the severe winter weather and all of the subsequent heavy snow hindered the searches, and the Air Force ultimately deemed that this flight and all its men were lost. The pilots' wives, because the pilots were very good friends, their wives and families were very good friends, to the point where one of the pilots married a French woman, Simone, and when she came over to the United States, there wasn't anybody to meet her in New York. So my father went to meet her in New York. And so the families then settled in the Vacaville area near Travis, and they continued their friendship for years. The women didn't want to give up. Those mothers had young children and families, and they just didn't want to give up their search. And they continued to engage with private citizen search parties for continuing for several weeks. So we could, the next slide. There were a lot of reports in various newspapers from Klamath Falls, La Grande, Oregon, all the way to San Bernardino about this lost flight. So, and this is a copy of the flight order. On Thursday, December 27th, the Vacaville, or the Vallejo News, said that the search efforts had to halt because of bad weather, but they did have a picture of the pilot and the names of all of the men that were lost. The search efforts were continued via private volunteers, and the wives put together a $1,000 reward if anybody could find the flight. Initially, the search was on 4 different counties, but then it did get narrowed because there were reports, people had heard planes around 5 o'clock in the afternoon that were flying way too low. So then it narrowed the search to a specific geographical area. Even though the search was continued by family members and volunteers, the Air Force did deem all men lost and issued the casualty reports in March 1952. Later, on May 30th, May 31st, snow had melted away, and there were now people and hikers throughout Lassen Park. There were some tourists that were from a different country, and they were out hiking in the back country, and they noticed some glistening off in the distance. And they were curious about what the sun was glistening off of, because it was very bright. They hiked up there, and they discovered the crash. Immediately reported it, of course, to the Park Service. On this first lower picture, The plane crashed on the ridge of Crescent Crater, and when it crashed, it went nose down, and the whole thing accordioned. And that is one of the original pictures that the Air Force took. And then this is a different, from the back, you can see the wings and the tail are all pretty much accordioned together. This is another spot. You can see the cabin, and then the whole plane accordioned. So the 3 crew members, it is believed that they died on impact. The plane did burn, although it didn't completely burn. And the remains of all 8 men were taken to Reading coroner's office. That fuselage wasn't fully removed from that crash site for nearly 30 years. And when I went there in 2012 with my cousin, who is an outdoorsman, an avid hiker, backpacker, he had gotten information from the government about the logistics of that crash site. And he went several times to hike there to find it, and he did. He took me there in 2012 for my 60th birthday. It's a good hour and a half up the hill to this back area. It's not a trail, and there are a lot of precautions. You're not supposed to go back there. But we did anyway. We were curious. And when I got to the crash site, I noticed that there is a lot of debris still there. The starboard engine and the port engine, the housing is still there. It was there in 2012. There's a lot of wires, there's a lot of debris, there's a lot of glass in that crash field, even though a lot of the forest has grown up around it. So that was a pretty emotional experience for me to go there. Then I started looking at war memorials, and I started looking at specifically Korean war memorials, and I noticed that none of these men were listed on those. And I was told, you tell me if this is true or not. If someone is lost stateside during a conflict, they're not put on memorials, is that correct? Okay, I didn't like that, so I found it rather offensive. And so I set about trying to find those other members, and I went on Ancestry, and I started looking up these men and whose trees they were on. And I reached out, and I was able to make contact with 3 of the other families. And I let them know that I was here and that I thought that we needed to do something. They all agreed, and we set our sights on building a horse trail. But after we contacted the Department of the Interior and a few Congress people, it was deemed unreasonable to do that. The landscape's just too fragile for any kind of a trail, particularly a horse trail. But the Park Service did offer an alternative. I got a letter from the Department of Interior. They hiked up to the crash coordinates with archaeological technicians. They looked over the area and realized that it just wasn't going to work for any kind of trail or any kind of, I wanted a wooden memorial at that site, and they just weren't able to do that. But what they were able to do was to offer a guided hike with one of the rangers for family members, and then they would have a display or history information about the crash, because it's part of the park's history. And so that's what we ended up doing. But in order to do that, I had to contact a lot of different people. Oh, yeah. So we went, I reached out to Congresswoman Doris Matsui, Assemblyman Brian Dahl, Congressman Doug LaMalfa. Brian sent a letter of support and wanted this to be done. Doug LaMalfa had handed me over to his contact in Washington, D.C., who handles the natural resources issues. They put me in contact with Jim Richardson, the superintendent of Lassen Park, and he put me in touch with Amanda Sweeney, a media specialist, and she's the one that designed the memorial placard. Colonel Kozak was a commander at Travis, and he arranged for 4 reservists to be at a memorial that was planned inside the park on August 18, 2018. And we can go to the next slide. The hike was in the morning before our memorial service, and those are nephews, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of one of the pilots. 2 of those nephews came from out of state. One came from Iowa and one came from Minnesota. This is a picture showing them going up the steep hike. It took them nearly 2 hours with the ranger guide. And then this is inside the visitor center at the south entrance of Lassen Park with Superintendent Richardson and 2 of the reserve officers that came from the Air Force. They happened to, the 4 that came happened to live in Northern California, and so they came in uniform. And we can go to the next slide. They allowed us to have this auditorium. We set up a display. There were family members from 3 different families: the pilot's family, the co-pilot's family, and one of the hitchhikers who was a navigator. Those 3 officers had all served in World War II. They had all gone into the reserves. They had all started their families. They had started their civilian lives. And in October '51, they were reactivated and to Travis. And the officer McCartney from Fairchild, he had been settled in Southern California and had built a home, and they were very happy there. He was reactivated and sent to Fairchild in Spokane, Washington. The reason that he was hitchhiking on that particular flight was because his father was in the Bay Area and his father was in the hospital. And he wanted to go see him. And so he took the ride down there on Christmas Eve, the day after Christmas. One of the things I learned from his daughter, Kathy, was that he and his wife had argued about him taking that flight. She didn't think her father-in-law was sick enough, and he said, "It's my dad, I'm going." The other thing that Kathy told me was that she and her siblings and her mother had been in base housing, but as soon as the men were declared dead, they were told they had to vacate base housing. And they had to go then move in with the in-laws in the Bay Area. She was the one, she raced horses, and she's the one that wanted the horse trail. And that didn't happen. This is how we set it up. We did have a minister that said some prayers. We had music. My son set up the music that played. And then we did the lighting of the candles. that last picture of the two women lighting the candles, we were both daughters of the pilots. And we had a candle for each one of the 8 men. And they ranged in age from 36 to 19. And in my research, I've never been able to find the 19-year-old's wife. He had married Alice in Washington State a week after she turned 18, and that was in April '51. And I think between April and December, it's feasible that she could have been pregnant. But I never was able to find her or find out if there was anybody the same age as me or younger than me that was a surviving child also. This particular placard is what the media specialist put together, and that was on display in the South Entrance Visitor Center. It has since been moved to the Northern Museum. It's called the Loomis Museum of Park History, and it's up by Lake Manzanita, if any of you are familiar with that area. I haven't been there to see it because we moved up here and I just haven't been back down to Northern California for any hiking lately. I do appreciate the assistance that I got from multiple people, and the feeling of that their story still can live on. When I got together with those other siblings, or those other children, I learned that each one of our mothers had their own version, their own legend of what went on. But one of the things was that the two pilots weren't wanting to fly on Christmas Day. And they kind of had to talk each other into it because they were best friends. They go, let's just go. And so those two wives, Simone and Dorothy, both had kind of bitter stories about that, as you would imagine. They were not unlike so many thousands of other wives or family members that would have those kind of harsh feelings. But we all still support, absolutely, our military. And we understand these things happen. I just wanted to make sure that it didn't get lost in the shuffle. So I am grateful for all the help I got from the congressmen and the representatives, from the Park Service, from the superintendent, from his ranger that allowed a group of family members to go up there. And it is a very odd feeling when you have all these people that come together and the only thing you have in common is that your fathers died at the same instant. It's a very odd feeling. It's still an odd feeling. And so that's kind of my story. I have a lot of newspaper articles, pictures, information, all different kinds of dates. The San Diego newspaper newspaper said, hope was fading to find the missing 8 men. There were 17 or 18 reports of a low-flying plane, or that something appeared to be falling. There was no word to indicate that the C-47 for Spokane made any kind of a safe landing. They had, initially there were more than 100 planes that were ready to take off, and they concentrated on that 4-county area, and then of course it got narrowed down to a specific area. But the members of or when it was reported, when it was finally, the fuselage or the crash site was finally discovered in May, then they sent the Air Force, of course, to investigate the accident. It crashed on the east side of Crescent Crater, 1 2/3 miles northeast of Lassen Peak, at an elevation of 7,800 feet. Ground point of impact sloped slightly 40 degrees. There was no evidence of any part of the aircraft having struck the ground at any place short of the point of impact. And the force of the impact caused the fuselage to accordion so that the tail section was even with the trailing edge of the wings. Fire subsequently occurred after impact and consumed a large portion of the fuselage. The wings were laying atop the ground and they were parallel to magnetic north and south. The probable time of the crash, because remember their last communication in Klamath Falls was at 4:17, but according to watches that they found at the site, they established that probable crash time was 17:15 to 17:28 Pacific Standard Time. And they did identify that the bodies, the pilot, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer were in the correct positions. Because this was a transport plane, it had the seats, and so I sometimes imagine that the men were sitting across from each other. And I had an opportunity last October to go inside one of these transport planes. It is at an air museum in Mesa, Arizona. And it was very odd to walk in that plane and walk through it and then see the cabin. They do take people up on that plane, and I'm trying to get a couple of my cousins to go with me and take the plane up in December. Of course, we're not going to do it on the anniversary because it's going to be too cold, but I thought, you know, maybe the first week of December would be a good time. And that's about all I have. I don't know if you have any questions. I know I've forgotten something, but you know what? If I probably gave you a lot of information already. But does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any knowledge or recollection or anything about that particular time period? No? Okay. Well, I guess that's the end of me. I hope I didn't bore you too much.
Thank you, Jacklyn. Very good. I'd like to present this Warhawk coin for you for coming in. And Jacklyn will be around if you want to just come up and chat. And that concludes pretty much our program for this morning. Thank you.